Hello and welcome to another tutorial. We are looking at the Java language basics, and now we are at the last item, which is switch expressions, which is a new addition to the Java programming language. So we saw switch statements, which is the classical or the conventional format of the switch. You switch over a parameter of some allowed type, and then you have cases that look for the exact match. But then switch expression allows you to actually, because we know that an expression in Java has to evaluate to something, which means the result of evaluation is the return value of that expression, right? That's why switch expressions convey the idea that now you have a statement with a body, and the entire switch can return a value. Not just from a method, right? We already saw that in the switch statement. We can have return a statement that immediately return from the method. But sometimes you want to say, for example, you want to assign the result of the switch to a variable. With the switch statement, you cannot do that. You have to define and initialize that variable outside the switch. And in the cases of the switch, you decide what values to assign to that outside variable. But with the switch expressions, now you can basically assign the value of the switch to a variable. So modifying the switch syntax in Java 14, so they added this switch expression, or they came up with this idea from Java 14. You can use another more convenient syntax for the switch keyword, the switch expression. And again, it's the difference between the conventional switch and the fact that this one is a switch expression. Several things have motivated this new syntax. The default control flow behavior between switch labels is to fall through, and we saw in depth what it means to have the fall through, right? And we said that it's best to avoid relying on the fall through behavior. This syntax is error prone and leads to bugs in applications. And to refresh your memory, fall through means when the first case that matches the switch argument, the other cases become invisible. So those conditions are not tested anymore. So if you don't have a break, then all of the other statements become available for evaluation, because the other case statements, the other case labels become invisible. The switch block is treated as one block. This may be an impediment in the case where you need to define a variable only in one particular case. What it means is that basically, if for example, if you define something here, int x equals 5, basically, so we already have x, let's say z equals 5. So we have this, and then this z is also available in other case. So I can say z equals 10. And this is available, which means this the entire body is one scope, which means if I define something in this case, I have it, I cannot redefine it here, right? Now we already saw that in general in the Java you can use curly braces to define a scope. So we also use z, let's use w. Now you see, now we explicitly add a scope to case, which means this w is now really confined within this scope. So this w doesn't exist and we can reuse it again. So the idea of the fact that if you do, because typically with the conventional syntax of the case, we don't use curly braces, but then local variables in each case are visible to other cases too. And that this is something that you might not want to happen. But again, the solution is relatively easy. You just define an explicit pair of curly brackets so that you limit the where these local variables are used. So I mean, item 2 might not be that relevant because you can always do it manually, right? Item 3, the switch statement is a statement. In the examples of the previous sections, a variable is given a value in each case. Making it an expression could lead to better and more readable code. And it just means that you cannot assign the result of this switch. You cannot say int w equals switch over x, and then each case return some value. You cannot do that, right? So you have to initialize this value outside and then assign values to that parameter or that variable in each case, right? So the syntax covered in the previous section known as switch statement, that's the terminology we used, is still available in Java 14 and onward, right? And its semantics did not change. So you can still use the regular or conventional switch statement. Starting with Java 14, a new syntax for the switch is available, the switch expression. This syntax modifies the syntax of the switch label. Suppose you have the following switch statement in your application. Now before that, we also looked at the case where basically you could use comma separated values. Let's see where we used it. Yeah, so this was also added from Java 14, and the reason they add this, they actually thought about this after thinking about switch expressions. They wanted to make it more readable, because they wanted to really show that you shouldn't in your source code space not to rely or exhibit the fall through behavior. That's why they added these comma separated values, which means this is only one case. Previously you had to say case 1, case 3, case 5 and show that you are relying on fall through. So they decided to add this way. Then if somebody reads your code, they realize that this is just one case with multiple labels. That's fine, but it's only one case. It doesn't convey the notion that you're looking at the fall through behavior. I mean, behind the scenes it's actually translates into the fall through behavior, which is fine, but at least in the source code it's much easier to understand. So they added these comma separation labels from Java 14. At the same time, they also added this switch expression. So yeah, so let's look at this. So this is the conventional switch statement. So we want to switch over some variable, so we have to initialize it outside, and it has to be one of the supported types for switch, which is int or integer wrapper class. They are supported. And then based on the value and the cases, we want to eventually assign some value, this variable len. At the moment, you cannot say len equals switch on day and return the appropriate value. So you have to initialize it outside the switch, and then in different cases, you have to assign values to this len, right? So when you hit the end of the body of the switch, your len value has the appropriate value, right? Now with the switch expression, this becomes much more concise. Note that even here we could use comma separated values, case Monday, Friday, Sunday, right? But then they added this comma separated label support just to make the switch expressions much more easy to write and read actually, right? So if I create a new class here, a switch expression, right? So what we're going to do is basically public static void test1, and in the main we're going to invoke test1, and I'm going to use the conventional basically switch here, right? Now at the moment we don't have this, so we can define this as constants. Public static final int Monday equals 0, and then Friday we can say Monday is 0, for example. Saturday is 1, Monday or basically Tuesday is 1, and then Wednesday, let's say it's 2, and Thursday, let's say it's 3, and then let's say Friday is 4, and then Saturday is 5, and then Sunday is 6. I'm just assigning these numbers. It doesn't matter what the actual numbers is, we just want to do a switch on them. So we define this compile time constants. Let's say day is 2, for example, right? And then we're switching, and we define this. We have to define this variable outside the switch, right? And have to also initialize it. And then what happens is that we switch on this int, and then the cases we're relying on the fall through, and we said that instead of this we could just use the comma separation, Note that the comma separation wasn't allowed before Java 14. So this is the original syntax from Java 8, for example. So Monday, Friday, and then Sunday, we do this, right? And this works Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So case Thursday and Saturday, and then the comma is allowed. And Wednesday, right? So if we run this, we're going to get the result, len 9, which means we are hitting Wednesday, right? So how do we transform this into switch expressions? Obviously, the step 1 is to use these comma separations to make it more readable. And then step 2 is to use the syntax of the switch. So I'm going to create test 2 here. So they had different proposals of how to return a value from switch, because remember, we don't want to use the, let's say, we don't want to say here, for example, return 8, because the problem is that this returns from the method itself. But we don't want to do that. We want to, instead of saying int len, instead of initializing, defining and initializing length outside, we want to say int len equals this, right? So we remove this. And then instead of having breaks, we could do different things. One here, we could, after the case labels, we use the arrow, which is Java compiler already recognizes that. Remember, arrow was introduced in Java 8, right? So arrow operator introduced in Java 8 for lambda expressions, the concise notation. Once we get to the tutorials on the basically on the lambda expressions, I will show you how to use this. But we use the arrow operator. We say return 6 and semicolon, right? And then here we say arrow return 7. And then we're going to say that here return 8. And then for Wednesday, we say arrow return 9. Okay. Now I have a compilation error. What is it? What is this here? A switch expression should have a default case, and makes sense because now they're saying that you're returning something, right? So the main difference is that note that in this case for the conventional switch statement, we didn't have a default, which is fine. I mean, because you just go into the body and you check the cases. If none of the cases match, you just don't do anything, right? You just come out of the body of the switch. But with switch expression, it has to return a value. It has to return a value. And the question is, if none of the case labels match, what value should we return, right? So we have to have a default, and here we're going to say arrow or -1, for example, right? Now it works. So switch, and then remember that this is an assignment. This whole switch, this is like one expression. And if you recall in our definition of a statement was that basically this switch and the assignment operator, this is one full statement, and any statement has to be terminated with semicolon. So the entire switch is the right hand side of the assignment operator, right? So the entire switch on the right hand side will be evaluated and its return value. So the arrow operator means we are returning something from the body of the switch, which means we don't return from the method itself. We just that's why they didn't they couldn't use the return keyword here, because then you return always means just jump out of the method call immediately, whereas you don't want to do that here, right? So they had the proposal of the yield keyword, and we will look at the yield later. But for the moment, if you have if you just want to return something, one value, you have one line of code, then you use the arrow operator, and then semicolons also I believe necessary. Yeah, you have to have the semicolon here to terminate. Each one of these cases is one statement, and as you can see, this is very concise and nice. It's very clear what's going on. You're checking against the 3 labels. If any of this match, you return a value. So it's much more concise, and you immediately assign it to this variable len So this is part of the assignment, right? So if you run this, we're getting the same value 9. So that's how switch expression works, right? You just say int len equals, so because this switch can actually return some value. And as you can see, they don't have a default case here. And basically, maybe they define this as enums, but if you define them as basically integers, then you should have a default value. Or maybe this was something that they added, because right now I'm using Java 16 to run, so maybe this is something that they added in Java after Java 14. So I can switch to, for example, Java 14. We could try that, or let's say with Java 16. And yeah, I guess in the recent versions of JDK, you should have a default value so that the compiler knows that eventually something has to be returned from the body of this switch, right? Now, if you define these days of the week as enums, then enums are always a complete set, which means the compiler knows beforehand that the number of labels is limited to the enum type. So if you use enums, then you don't need to have a default label here. You don't have a default case just for the enums, because compiler already knows that the number of cases is limited. But then you have to use all the types of the enum. You have to make sure that you use all the values that are in the enum, that enum covers. Otherwise, the compiler gives a compilation error saying that basically some cases are not covered, so you have to cover them or give a default value. So if you don't cover all the cases of enum, you either have to give a default case or you just cover all the cases, right? That's the caveat with enums. The syntax of switch label is case something arrow operator. Only the code to the right of the label is executed if the label is matched, right? So this one, and note that right now you see that using the arrow operator, we are only allowed to have one line of code, some constant that we're returning. For example, let's say we have something like int x equals 5 here. Can I say instead of 6, return 6 times x? Yes, so we can have an expression. Can we have multiple lines of code here? Basically 6 times maybe int w equals this, and then return. So the question is, when we have multiple lines of code, right? How do we return some? Because right now this arrow is just covers the entire thing, but you have to have some sort of explicit keyword that tells you to return. So let's see if we can use yield here, and yes, we can use. So they added this yield keyword. So this is an addition to the keywords that Java language supports, and that's just because in this specific case you still use the arrow operator, but then you open a scope and then you write multiple lines of code. So if you only have one line of code which just evaluates to something and then you return it, then you don't need to open a curly braces and you don't need to use the yield keyword. You just say return this, and the compiler understands what you're talking about, what you want. But if you have multiple line of code, the question is, how do we return something from the body here, right? Because if you have multiple lines of code, then which line is actually the returned value that you want to this case return, right? So you have to explicitly tell the compiler return this value, and here we're saying that return w. So let's see, Monday was 0, so let's try 0, or we can just type it, right? Monday. If we run this, we are still getting 30 because x is 5, 30, and then yield w. So yield is a new keyword for the switch expression. You cannot use it in the original switch statement. That yield only works in the switch expression. And so the use case is when you have multiple lines of code for a case. because then you have to explicitly tell the compiler, hey, I did these calculations from this line of code, now grab this value and yield it, which means return it. Remember, we cannot use return because return is specifically reserved for jumping out of the method. But obviously here we want to jump out of this switch expression. So they had to come up with something else, yield. If you're familiar with other programming languages like Python, you know that yield has a much different meaning in Python or even C++. Like, so in Python, yield is used for a much different concept called generators, right? Something that you can save the state of the method and return back to iterator. This is something that you don't see in Java. Basically, in Python, you can, instead of using the return keyword to return from method, you can use the yield keyword. And it still returns from the method, but then if you call the method again, you jump back from, it kind of saves the memory or the state of the function or method. And then you come back and then you continue exactly from you left off. But remember, that's not the case in Java. This yield keyword doesn't have that meaning that Python has, right? It doesn't, it doesn't apply to the concepts like generators or coroutines. Yeah, so yield here is just a simple keyword, means just jump out of the switch statement. That's it, or switch expression rather. Alright, so because this code is one block, you can define variables in it and are local to this particular block. So you can still define variables in it. This syntax also supports multiple constants per case with a comma, and again, this is something they added from Java 14, separated by commas as shown in the previous example. So this was the introduction to the switch expression. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please stay tuned and I'll see you in the next one.